The city rested beneath a pale sky. Columns of marble reflected the fading light of evening, and the slow murmur of distant voices drifted through the air. Rome was vast, filled with movement, yet within its greatness there was a sense of stillness. Streets of stone stretched in long lines toward the horizon, meeting arches and courtyards where fountains whispered quietly. The empire stood at the height of its glory, but the calm of its surface carried a deeper silence, one that came when triumph had already reached its peak. Across the city, torches began to glow. Their flames trembled along the walls of temples and theaters, painting soft shapes upon the stone. In the markets, the day's trade came to an end. Merchants closed their stalls, soldiers walked in small groups, and the scent of bread and oil hung in the air. Beyond the hum of the streets, the grand palaces of the rulers rose above the city like islands of gold. Their halls were filled with light and music, yet beneath that splendor was a quiet weight, a sense that the rhythm of life had grown too rich, too heavy, too still. Inside these halls, marble floors stretched beneath mosaics that told the stories of victory and conquest. The air was warm, perfumed with smoke and wine. Servants moved silently, carrying silver trays through corridors that seemed endless. The guests spoke softly, their words blending with the sound of stringed instruments. Laughter came and went, measured and careful. Every gesture, every glance seemed practiced, as if the people themselves had become part of the decoration. Around them, statues of former rulers watched with calm and unchanging eyes. Beyond the palaces, the city spread in every direction, filled with houses, baths, gardens, and arenas. In the great amphitheater, the crowds had already departed, leaving behind only the smell of dust and iron. The sand of the arena, still darkened from the day's games, lay silent under the moon. A few workers swept the stands in slow, circular motions. Their brooms moved without hurry, tracing the outline of spectacle that had already faded. The cheers of the afternoon were gone, and in their absence, the space felt endless. Rome's beauty was unmatched, yet the same order that shaped its perfection also carried a faint emptiness. The empire had built roads that reached every known land, brought art and learning to its people, and filled its cities with wealth. Still behind the walls of abundance, there lingered a fatigue that came from long success. The citizens moved through their routines like actors in a play that never ended. Authority was everywhere, power was absolute, but the spark of purpose had grown dim. The empire continued to move forward by habit, its grandeur sustained by memory rather than desire. Night deepened over the Tiber. The river flowed slowly, carrying the reflections of lamps and bridges upon its surface. From the hills, the sound of the water mixed with the faint calls of animals in the distance. The city, seen from above, looked like a vast constellation of light. Yet even in its glow, one could sense the stillness of exhaustion, as if the weight of its own greatness had begun to press upon the hearts of its people. The pulse of Rome was steady, but it no longer quickened. In the houses of the common citizens, the same calm spread. Children slept beside small fires. The smell of grain filled the rooms. Outside, footsteps passed quietly through the alleys. The people were neither joyful nor sorrowful. They lived in the middle ground between comfort and weariness. The empire provided everything they needed, but little that stirred them. The rhythm of their days was the same as the rhythm of their parents and their grandparents, smooth, unbroken, almost without sound. Far from the noise of the city, villas stood among the hills, surrounded by gardens and still pools. The owners walked slowly along stone paths lined with cypress trees. They watched the sky turn from gold to grey and listened to the faint call of birds returning to their nests. In these moments, the empire felt eternal, endless, unchanging. Yet that very stillness carried within it the first breath of decline. The marble that gleamed in the sunlight would one day crack. The fountains would one day run dry. But for now, everything remained perfect, suspended in balance. As the night reached its quietest hour, the city seemed to sleep with open eyes. Fires burned in the watchtowers, their light trembling across the rooftops. The wind moved gently through the empty streets. Somewhere, a musician played a single slow melody on a reed flute, the notes floating through the darkness until they disappeared. Rome, vast and powerful, rested within its own shadow, unaware of how heavy its silence had become. And so in that calm, the empire continued radiant yet distant, full yet hollow, bright but fading softly beneath the endless sky. Nero, the emperor at the height of sin. The night in Rome was quiet, but inside the golden palace of the emperor, light never faded. Flames shimmered behind sheets of glass, casting warm patterns across the marble walls. The air carried the faint sound of strings and distant singing, a soft melody that drifted through the corridors like smoke. Servants moved carefully, their steps silent, their faces calm. The emperor was awake, and when the emperor did not sleep, the city itself seemed to hold its breath. Nero was still young, but his presence filled every corner of his world. He had inherited an empire at its richest moment, a power so vast that even the seas bowed to its name. Yet within him lived a restlessness that no wealth could calm. He desired beauty, praise, and endless admiration. He loved the stage, the sound of music, the art of words. When he spoke, he wished to be heard not as a ruler, but as a performer before the eyes of eternity. He was the emperor, and yet he longed to be the artist who could command hearts through the softness of his voice. At his command, new theatres rose from the earth. Marble seats circled wide arenas where actors performed by torchlight. He sat among them not as a distant god, but as one of their own. When he sang, the people listened in silence, afraid to breathe too loudly. His songs spoke of heroes and tragedies, of stars that fell into the sea, of lovers who vanished into memory. The court clapped softly, not daring to stop before he did. He smiled, not in joy but in satisfaction, as if the sound of their obedience was the true music he desired. Within the palace, his nights stretched endlessly. Banquets filled the halls, their tables heavy with silver plates and fruits glistening under the oil lamps. Wine flowed in slow rivers from one cup to another. Poets recited verses written to please him. Painters unveiled new works that carried his image. He laughed, but the sound had no warmth. It was measured, echoing through the grand chamber, like the strike of a bell. Around him, the courtiers mirrored his mood, laughing when he did, falling silent when his eyes darkened. In those moments, every man and woman understood that his favor was both life and danger. Nero loved spectacle more than truth. When he rode through the streets in gilded chariots, the crowds knelt along the road. Flowers rained from balconies and children shouted his name. He raised his hand in acknowledgement, the gesture slow, almost tender. Behind the beauty of the procession, soldiers stood in quiet vigilance. They were the reminder that beneath the music of power, the machinery of control still turned. His empire was built not only on admiration, but on fear that moved without sound. The Senate feared his temper, yet they praised him with careful devotion. They bowed deeply, their words woven with flattery that hid anxiety. When he entered the chamber, silence followed him like a shadow. He listened to their speeches with calm detachment, his face unreadable. A simple nod from him could bring a man honor or erase his name from the world. Each decision was made without visible emotion, as though he were painting a picture with lives instead of colors. Behind the scenes, the palace was alive with whispers. Servants spoke in low voices when they believed no one could hear. The walls carried rumors through the corridors like wind. Those who once stood close to the emperor sometimes vanished overnight, their absence explained only by silence. Loyalty was prized above talent, and fear became the language of survival. Yet amid this tension, life within the palace continued with graceful routine. The gardens were tended, the fountains kept flowing, the musicians practiced each dawn. Beauty remained untouched, even as the foundations trembled beneath it. In the private chambers, Nero surrounded himself with instruments and scrolls. He spent long hours shaping melodies, drawing lines upon wax tablets, and speaking to no one. Music was the only thing that quieted his thoughts. He believed that in sound there was perfection, and in perfection there was peace. But peace never came. Each song ended too soon. Each note faded before he wished it to. He demanded more, always more, as if beauty itself could be captured and made to stay. Servants waited outside the door, listening to the rhythm of his playing, knowing that when the music stopped, someone would be called and orders would follow. The city outside continued to live beneath his rule. The people built monuments, carved statues, and held festivals in his name. Yet behind their celebration there was unease. Taxes grew, rules multiplied, and those who disobeyed were quietly removed from sight. The empire had become a stage, its citizens actors in a play directed by one man's desire. Rome's grandeur remained, but its heart had grown faint. The harmony that once united its people was replaced by quiet endurance. In the garden of his palace, Nero often walked alone. The air was cool and carried the scent of laurel and smoke. Pools of water reflected the stars above, unbroken and still. He paused often to look at his own reflection in the surface, his face glowing softly in the lamplight. To him, it was not the image of a man, but of something greater, something born to shape the world with will and vision. Around him, statues of past emperors stood in perfect symmetry, their stone eyes gazing outward. He passed them without notice, believing that his light would outlast their shadows. Time within the palace felt endless. Seasons passed, but the rhythm of excess did not change. New halls were built, old ones expanded, walls were painted with scenes of his victories and triumphs. Gold leaf shimmered along the ceilings like captured sunlight. To those who visited, it seemed as if Rome had reached the very edge of perfection. Yet the closer one looked, the more fragile it appeared. The laughter of the guests echoed strangely through the empty corridors once they departed. The smell of wine and incense lingered in the air long after the music had stopped. Beauty had become a mask worn too long, one that could no longer be removed. Nero's nights grew quieter as years passed. He played his music before smaller audiences now, often before only a few trusted faces. His voice remained soft, steady, controlled. When he sang, the words filled the chamber like a slow river. The listeners bowed their heads, not from emotion, but from reverence carefully practiced. Outside, the empire stretched on, vast and obedient, while within its heart, the emperor's solitude deepened. He had everything he could imagine, yet nothing seemed to satisfy him. The lights of Rome burned through the night, but for him, the glow only revealed the emptiness it surrounded. In the stillness before dawn, the palace would fall silent at last. The fires dimmed, and the musicians put away their instruments. Nero would stand at his balcony, looking across the city. The rooftops spread before him, endless and pale under the first light of morning. Smoke rose gently from the hearths of ordinary homes. Somewhere far below, a cart rolled over the cobblestones, its wheels echoing softly. He listened to that sound for a long time. It was the sound of a world beyond his reach, a rhythm untouched by power. He turned away and closed the doors behind him. Inside, the air was heavy and still. And so the emperor remained upon his throne, surrounded by beauty, guarded by silence, and consumed by the slow unraveling of his own creation. The empire continued to serve, the people continued to bow, the lights continued to burn. But beneath it all, the quiet truth of decline had already begun to breathe. Power, once bright, had turned into shadow, and within that shadow, the emperor sat alone, listening to the fading echo of his own song. Rome on the edge of collapse. The morning light touched the rooftops of the city, and Rome woke slowly beneath its weight. The empire stretched beyond the horizon, its borders guarded by legions, its cities filled with merchants and builders. From the hilltops one could see the wide sweep of roads that reached toward distant lands, glimmering faintly like threads of stone. The city itself shimmered in the haze of heat, its temples and arches rising above the sound of footsteps and market cries. It was a vision of power, yet within its order there was something heavy and still, a feeling that the rhythm of greatness had begun to slow. In the markets, people moved among baskets of grain, cloth, and fruit. Voices blended into a steady hum. The air smelled of dust, oil, and baked bread. Children played near fountains, their laughter carried by the wind. Soldiers walked in pairs through the streets, their armor reflecting the sun. Everything seemed to move as it always had, yet beneath the calm there was a sense of waiting, as if the city itself understood that change was near but could not speak of it. The great avenues were crowded with processions and carriages. Statues of emperors and generals lined the paths, their faces frozen in the pride of long-past victories. Citizens bowed as they passed, not from admiration, but from habit. The empire had grown too large, too confident in its own reflection. Its laws reached everywhere, but its heart had begun to drift. The people obeyed the rules, yet their loyalty was to the motion of routine, not to the meaning behind it. Authority remained strong, but belief had become quiet and thin. In the palaces, the nobility lived behind walls of luxury. Their gardens bloomed with imported flowers, their tables overflowed with delicacies brought from every province. Servants moved through the halls with silent precision, tending to the endless rhythm of comfort. Music played softly through the evenings, and the sound of conversation filled the air. But the words were light and empty, meant to fill silence rather than share thought. The grandeur of Rome had become its own performance, polished and practiced, yet hollow at its core. Far below the marble terraces, the common people carried the weight of the empire's needs. They worked in the fields, in the forges, in the workshops that supplied the city's endless appetite. Grain ships arrived each week from across the sea, unloading their cargo under the watch of soldiers. Bread was distributed freely to the crowds, a gift that kept the peace but dulled the spirit. The people had learned to expect plenty without effort, and the rulers had learned to maintain calm through comfort rather than vision. The balance was delicate, and beneath its surface, cracks were beginning to show. In the Senate, long debates unfolded without urgency. The senators spoke in smooth phrases, their words circling around decisions that never truly changed anything. They were careful with their tone, cautious in their opinions. The empire's machine was too vast to stop, too old to turn quickly. Power shifted quietly from one set of hands to another, yet nothing moved forward. Beyond the marble walls, the world continued to change, but within the city, time felt suspended. The past held everything, and the present simply mirrored its image. Outside the capital, the provinces followed their own rhythms. Governors ruled with independence, collecting taxes and commanding local armies. The roads that once brought unity now carried distance. Reports reached Rome more slowly, and the sense of connection began to fade. At the empire's edges, small tribes and foreign kingdoms tested their strength. Battles flared in remote valleys, and although victory was declared, the cost was always heavier than before. The legions fought bravely, but their loyalty was to pay, not to purpose. Each victory felt less like triumph and more like delay. In the streets of Rome, people spoke less of conquest and more of survival. The market still thrived, but whispers spread through the alleys. Some said the taxes would rise again, others that the soldiers would soon return to enforce new laws. There were stories of grain shortages, of lands that no longer sent their tribute. The air grew tense, not with open fear, but with quiet unease. It was as if the city, still bright in the sun, could feel the ground shifting beneath it. At night, the lamps burned through the darkness, and the city glowed like a cluster of stars fallen to earth. But the glow was deceptive. The nights grew longer, and the sounds of laughter softer. Taverns still opened their doors, yet the joy that once filled them was now replaced by habit. The songs that once celebrated victory were sung slower, their notes fading before they reached the chorus. The people no longer looked toward the future with excitement. They looked toward it as one might look toward an approaching storm, distant yet certain. In the heart of the city, the great amphitheater stood silent after the games. Its arches rose like bones against the night sky. The sand of the arena was smooth again, swept clean of the day's spectacle. The crowds that had filled its seats were gone, leaving only echoes of their voices. The silence that followed the roar of thousands was deep and heavy, as if the earth itself had absorbed their sound. The empire loved entertainment, but its appetite for it had become endless. Each performance had to outshine the last, each show a mirror reflecting the emptiness of satisfaction that could never last. The people were not cruel, they were tired. The rulers were not blind, they were lost in comfort. The empire had given them everything, and in return, they had forgotten how to seek meaning beyond it. Wealth flowed, but wisdom drained away. The builders continued to raise monuments, yet no one remembered why they were built. The stones gleamed under the sun, but their stories had faded. The empire's greatness, once born of purpose, now rested upon inertia. In the countryside, the rhythm of life remained slower. Farmers rose before dawn, their tools worn from use. The land still yielded harvests, though not as abundant as before. Fields that had once thrived began to tire, their soil less generous with each passing year. The roads between villages cracked and crumbled, unattended for too long. The empire's reach was still wide, but its grasp had loosened. The people worked quietly, knowing that the world beyond their fields was too distant to care for them. They no longer looked to Rome for guidance, only for the passing of the seasons. From the high towers of the palace, the city looked unchanged. Fires burned in the hearths, statues gleamed, and the river flowed steady and calm. Yet to those who watched closely, the signs were clear. The air carried less laughter. The buildings, though strong, needed repair. The markets, though full, moved slower. The empire had begun to bend beneath its own weight. The decline was not sudden. It was gentle, almost graceful, like the fading of light at dusk. As night returned, the emperor's palace glowed above the city. The same music played, the same voices murmured in low conversation. But outside its walls, a thin mist rose from the river, wrapping the streets in a soft haze. The glow of the lamps blurred through it, and the shapes of people became shadows. The city that had once believed itself eternal was quietly drifting into its next age, unaware that its power was already memory. In the stillness before dawn, the sound of hooves echoed faintly through the empty avenues. A messenger rode toward the palace, carrying news from the border. His horse moved quickly, its breath clouding the cold air. Behind him, the first light began to spread across the horizon. The city would soon wake again, its people ready to repeat the motions of another day. The empire still lived, still shone, still breathed. But within that steady rhythm, a small silence had begun to grow. It was the silence that comes before change, calm and endless, like the moment before a wave breaks upon the shore. And so Rome continued to stand, magnificent yet weary, its beauty untouched, and its spirit fading quietly beneath the surface of its own perfection. The empire had reached the edge of its own reflection, and though it did not yet see the end, the air already carried the weight of what was to come. The magic of other faiths. Across the ancient world, people looked toward the sky and saw stories written in the movement of the stars. The heavens were vast and patient, their light constant above fields, rivers, and stone cities. Each civilization found in that sky its own reflection. Some saw order, some saw mystery, and some saw the quiet presence of forces greater than themselves. These were the beginnings of the many beliefs that shaped the first understanding of life, death, and the space between. In the deserts of Egypt, the sun ruled all. Each morning it rose from the eastern horizon, steady and golden, bringing warmth to the fields and strength to the people who waited for its return. The farmers looked toward it with reverence, knowing that without its rhythm there would be no harvest. Temples of sandstone and granite were built to honor its path. Their corridors were long and cool, filled with carvings that told stories of light overcoming darkness, of balance restored through the cycle of days. The priests who guarded these places watched the heavens with care, recording the movement of each season. For them, the sun was not an object of worship, but a symbol of continuity, of life that never truly ended. Farther east, along rivers lined with palm and reed, others found meaning in the quiet flow of water. They believed the river carried not only the reflection of the sky, but the memory of those who came before. Offerings were placed at its edge, small gestures of respect for the unseen order that guided its current. Life and death were not separate things to them. They were two movements of the same stream, one giving way to the other, endlessly, without beginning or end. The people spoke softly of spirits that lived in trees, in stones, in the breath of wind. These spirits were neither kind nor cruel. They were simply present, woven into the pattern of existence. In the mountains of Greece, belief took another shape. There, the people imagined a world where the powers of nature walked among them, clothed in human form. The wind, the sea, the harvest, the flame, each had a name and a face. These stories were not born from fear, but from wonder. To speak of the gods was to speak of the world itself, its storms, its beauty, its unpredictability. On quiet evenings, the poets recited tales beside the fire, and the people listened not for truth, but for the comfort of recognition. The myths became mirrors reflecting the harmony and conflict that lived within all human hearts. In them, the people found both explanation and poetry. In the northern forests, where winters were long and the sun faint, belief carried the sound of wood and frost. The people there spoke of a great tree that stood at the center of the world, its roots touching the underworld and its branches reaching the sky. They imagined that all life hung from its limbs, held in delicate balance. The seasons were not enemies, but companions, each necessary to the other. When snow fell, it was not a punishment. It was a reminder of rest, of renewal that would come again when the light returned. Their songs were slow and deep, carried on the breath of the wind, sung to remind the living that endurance was its own kind of grace. Across the seas, in the islands of the rising mist, other traditions took form. In those lands, the people believed that everything contained a quiet energy, an unseen breath that moved through wood, stone, and wave. The forests were alive with presence, and the mountains were ancient guardians of the earth. The people walked softly upon the ground, careful not to disturb the invisible harmony that surrounded them. Their ceremonies were small and precise, marked by gestures of balance and respect. To live well was to live in rhythm with the world, to understand that even silence carried meaning. These different ways of seeing the world shared one quiet truth. They all sought to bring order to what could not be understood. They were not inventions of fear, but of attention. To look upon the rising sun, the flowing river, the endless sky, was to recognize that life was vast and fleeting. The stories built around these moments gave shape to wonder. They made the invisible visible. Through them, people learned to see meaning in repetition, in the turning of seasons, in the growth of crops, in the birth of children, in the fall of leaves. The cycles of the earth became lessons written in motion. In cities that rose and fell, temples stood as markers of time. Their stones carried the weight of prayers, of songs, of whispered hopes that faded yet never fully vanished. Within their walls, light filtered through narrow windows, cutting lines across the floor like quiet water. Offerings of grain, oil, or perfume filled the air with scent. The rituals were slow, deliberate, performed not to summon miracles, but to maintain balance. People came to these places not only to ask, but to remember, to remind themselves that they were part of something larger, something measured not in years, but in generations. Art and faith grew together. Painters covered walls with images of sky and flame. Sculptors carved the movement of bodies and the stillness of faces. Each piece of art was both a decoration and a meditation. It taught the viewer to pause, to look longer, to see beyond the surface. Music echoed through courtyards, its tones simple and patient. The rhythm of drums, the hum of string instruments, and the slow rise of voices created spaces of quiet focus. These sounds were not meant to impress, they were meant to carry the listener inward into a space where time moved differently. In daily life, the sacred and the ordinary were never far apart. A meal shared with family, a lamp lit at dusk, a story told before sleep, all carried traces of meaning. The people did not separate devotion from existence. To plant a seed, to weave cloth, to guide a ship across the sea were all acts of attention, of alignment with the invisible forces they believed surrounded them. In this way, the sacred was not something distant or unreachable. It was found in every gesture, in every breath, in every quiet act of care. As centuries passed, these traditions changed and intertwined. Empires rose, conquered, and blended their customs. The names of gods changed, their faces altered by new languages and lands, but the feeling behind them remained the same. The desire to understand, to belong, to feel harmony with the vastness of life endured. Temples turned to ruins, but the earth beneath them still held the memory of footsteps, the faint trace of incense carried by wind. The stones remembered the touch of hands that once placed offerings there, hands that sought only peace in the act of giving. Even as cities became greater and minds turned toward reason and philosophy, the old symbols remained. They survived in art, in stories, in gestures repeated without knowing why. A mother still whispered a blessing over her child. A traveler still paused before a mountain or a river, feeling its quiet weight. These actions were older than memory, born from the first moments when humanity looked outward and felt small, yet connected. The magic of belief, in all its forms, was never about control. It was about belonging. The magic of other faiths, seen from afar, was not about names or rituals. It was about the human wish to find rhythm in chaos, to see pattern in the unknown. Across the world, in different voices and languages, the same impulse appeared to give the invisible a shape that could be felt, to make beauty out of uncertainty. The people of every age carried this desire, shaping their lives through stories that guided their hearts as much as their hands. As night falls upon these ancient lands, the temples grow quiet, the fires within them burn low, and the smoke drifts upward into the dark. The stars return, countless and serene. Somewhere, a river continues to flow, its surface catching the reflection of light. The wind moves gently across the plains, carrying with it the faint echo of voices that once sang to the sky. Their words are gone, but their feeling remains a quiet, enduring presence that links all people across time. It is the sound of wonder, patient and endless, resting softly upon the world. The Norse myth between ice and fate. Far in the north, where the sun rises low and the winters last for many months, there lived people who carried their stories through wind and snow. The land was quiet and vast. Mountains rose like walls of stone. Rivers cut through valleys filled with mist. The sea stretched outward into endless grey, its surface cold and shining beneath a pale sky. In this world of frost and silence, the Norse people built their homes, tended their fires, and spoke of the powers that shaped their lives. Their days were measured by the changing of the seasons. In summer, the light lingered through long evenings and the air carried the sound of work and laughter. In winter, darkness rested upon the earth and families gathered near the hearth, listening to the voices of the old. These voices told stories of creation and ending, of the great tree that held all things together, of worlds connected through roots and branches, of gods and spirits who moved between them. The stories were not told to teach but to remember. They were the warmth of memory passed from one generation to the next. At the center of their belief stood the image of a great tree. Its roots reached deep into hidden places where water and memory flowed. Its trunk rose through the world of humans, steady and strong. Its branches stretched into the realm of the sky, where light and sound never ceased. This tree held the balance of all existence. Around it, the winds of time moved gently, carrying the breath of life from one world to another. To the Norse, this tree was not a god, but a map of being. It showed that everything was connected, that no life stood alone, and that all returns eventually to its beginning. The gods of the North were not distant figures. They walked through the same forests and sailed the same seas as those who spoke of them. They were strong yet flawed, wise yet capable of mistake. They represented the qualities the people admired: courage, patience, and the calm acceptance of fate. They were not perfect beings, but reflections of the people's own hopes and endurance. The stories spoke of Odin, who sought knowledge through sacrifice, and of Thor, whose strength guarded the world from chaos. They spoke of Freya, whose beauty carried both joy and sorrow, and of Loki, whose cunning brought change and conflict. Through these tales, the people saw their world mirrored in greater form. Each god had a place within the order of things. Each event had a meaning, and each life a purpose, even when unseen. The Norse did not fear destiny. They accepted it as part of the weave of time. What was written would come to pass, but within that pattern there was still room for honor, for choice, for courage. To meet one's fate with calm heart was to live well. To run from it was to forget the nature of existence itself. In this way, the stories did not command obedience. They taught presence, the simple art of living fully within what is. In the villages, the rhythm of belief was quiet and constant. The people carved symbols into wood and stone, not as idols but as reminders of connection. Runes were etched with care, their shapes simple and balanced. Each sign carried meaning: protection, strength, guidance, renewal. When ships set sail into the cold sea, these marks were traced upon their hulls. When a child was born, a charm was placed at the doorway to bless the new life. The faith of the Norse people lived not in temples but in gestures, in the steady repetition of small acts of care. The natural world was their teacher. The wind across the mountains, the movement of ice over water, the quiet fall of snow, these were signs to be read with patience. The storm was not punishment, nor was the calm a reward. Both were parts of the same whole. The people learned to listen, to move with the seasons rather than against them. In this harmony, they found strength. Life was short, but it was full. Each day carried its own worth simply by being lived. The feasts of the North were moments of gathering. Families and travelers came together in halls built of timber and stone. Fires burned in the center, and their light danced upon the faces of those who sat around them. Food was shared, songs were sung, and stories were told. The songs spoke of journeys, of sea voyages, of friendships tested and honored. They also spoke of endings, of the long sleep that awaited all. But the tone was calm, never mournful. Death was not an interruption. It was a continuation of the cycle. The people spoke of a hall beyond the world, where warriors rested beside their ancestors, where the fire never went out and the night was always still. In these words, there was no fear, only acceptance. Art flourished in simple forms. Wood carvings lined the edges of boats and doorways. Metalwork shimmered in patterns that mirrored the turning of waves and the flow of wind. The craftsmanship was precise, steady, and quiet. Each piece of work was an offering to time itself, a way of leaving a mark that could endure the passing of generations. The people believed that beauty was not in wealth but in the patience of creation. To shape a thing well was to honor life. To use it wisely was to honor balance. In their understanding of the world, the Norse people did not see good and evil as opposites. They saw them as forces that coexisted, each giving meaning to the other. The frost that killed the crops was also the frost that preserved the earth until spring. The night that brought stillness was also the night that allowed rest. Life was a circle of exchange, a pattern of giving and taking. Within this circle, every action carried weight, every word had echo. To live with awareness was to live rightly. The stories reminded them of this, that even the smallest act could ripple across the branches of the great tree. As time passed, the world around them began to change. Traders came from the south, carrying goods, languages, and new ideas. Ships crossed seas once thought endless. The old ways began to blend with the new. Yet the memory of the north endured. The songs were still sung, though their meanings shifted. The carvings still told the old tales, though their purpose softened. The people did not forget. They carried their heritage quietly, like a flame protected from wind. In their hearts, the old rhythm continued slow, steady, eternal. Even now, traces of that world remain. The northern lights move across the sky like living color, their glow reminding watchers of the fires once said to burn above the heavens. The forests still whisper in the same cold wind. The sea still strikes the rocks with patient strength. These are the echoes of that age, reminders that the ancient stories were not just invention, but reflections of how humans once listened deeply to the earth and to themselves. In the silence between snowfalls, it is easy to imagine the sound of a distant horn carried by the wind, or the quiet steps of someone walking through the frost beneath the stars. The Norse people lived close to that silence. They did not seek to fill it. They understood that silence too was a form of knowledge. It held space for the unseen, for the balance between what begins and what ends. Their world was built upon this understanding, that everything moves, that everything returns, that the cycle continues without need for judgment or fear. As night falls over the north, the horizon fades into mist. The fires of the longhouses burn with soft light, and the smoke rises into the dark. Inside, the people sleep beneath thick blankets of wool, their breath steady, their dreams quiet. Outside, the snow covers the land in white stillness. The trees stand unmoving. The stars appear one by one, watching over the frozen earth. The air is cold, but it is peaceful. The world rests in its balance, unchanged and eternal. The Norse stories endure not because they promise salvation or reward, but because they reflect the truth of living with simplicity. They speak of courage without pride, of wisdom without fear, of endings without sorrow. They remind us that all things are connected: the frost, the fire, the sea, the wind, the breath, the silence. And in that connection lies a quiet harmony, a stillness that neither time nor change can erase. The fall of empires and the silence of stone. The years passed like waves upon the shore, gentle at first, then steady, until the sound of greatness faded into quiet repetition. The empires that once filled the world with their power began to drift toward stillness. Their cities remained, their walls unbroken, their statues standing tall, but the life within them had changed. The voices that once shouted orders and praise now spoke softly or not at all. The air that had carried the sounds of marching feet and busy markets grew calm, filled instead with the murmur of the wind moving through empty streets. At the height of their power, these empires had believed themselves unending. They had built roads that crossed mountains, aqueducts that carried water from distant springs, and temples that touched the sky. They had carved their achievements into stone so that time itself might remember them. yet even stone wears thin beneath the passing of years. The carvings began to fade, the colors turned pale, and the stories they told became harder to see. The people who walked among them no longer remembered the names that once commanded fear or admiration. What remained was the structure without the spirit, beauty without motion, echo without voice. The fall did not come in thunder or flame. It arrived slowly, like the evening mist that rises from a field after rain. One by one, the old systems lost their rhythm. Trade routes grew quiet, markets emptied. The flow of wealth and goods that had once tied the world together loosened. Roads cracked, untraveled for months, then years. Fields, once rich with harvest, turned to grass. The change was not noticed at first, for it happened too gently. The people continued their routines, believing the silence to be temporary. But silence, once begun, deepened. In the grand cities, the palaces still shone beneath the sun, but their corridors no longer echoed with celebration. The rulers sat in chambers filled with gold and marble, surrounded by attendants who bowed but did not speak from the heart. Decisions were made, decrees were written, but each felt lighter than the one before. The weight of authority had grown thin. The empire was still vast, yet its reach no longer held meaning. Its armies stood ready, but their loyalty had become habit, not conviction. They guarded a power that no longer knew what to protect. Outside the walls, the countryside changed shape. Villages that had once paid tribute now kept their harvest for themselves. Small groups of travelers followed paths that twisted through forests and hills, seeking safety rather than conquest. The old sense of order began to fade, replaced by smaller rhythms of life. Where once the empire's law had ruled, now the laws of necessity and survival took its place. Yet even in this shift there was no chaos, there was only the quiet adjustment of people returning to simpler ways. The ruins of great buildings stood as reminders of what had been. Columns rose into the sky, cracked but still proud. The steps of temples led upward to empty doors. Birds nested in their corners, their songs filling the spaces where choirs once sang. Grass grew between the stones of once crowded forums. The sunlight moved slowly across the marble floors, untouched by footsteps. The cities became like open tombs, beautiful and calm, where the living world had withdrawn and left behind the memory of its presence. The silence of stone was not a sound of loss, but of transformation. Time moved differently within these ruins. The human sense of urgency disappeared. Seasons passed, and the wind carried the scent of rain through the broken arches. The sea, which had once brought ships from distant lands, now touched the edges of abandoned harbors. The waves came and went without audience, wearing the stones smooth with their patience. The earth began to reclaim what it had given. The roots of trees crept through cracks, their slow strength lifting fallen blocks as easily as breath. Nature asked for nothing and took everything back in silence. The fall of empires was not a single event, but a pattern repeated across the ages. One civilization ended, another began, each believing it would last forever. Yet in every age the same truth returned, that greatness was temporary and endurance belonged to the quiet elements that never sought power. Water, wind, and time moved without ambition, reshaping what humans had built with gentle persistence. The ruins that survived became lessons carved in stone, not of glory, but of stillness. Within these remains, travelers from later centuries found beauty of another kind. They walked among the fallen columns and felt a peace that had not existed in the noise of power. The emptiness invited reflection. The silence became a kind of voice, speaking not of conquest but of endurance. Artists came to draw the fragments of statues, poets wrote of the loneliness of broken cities, and philosophers spoke softly of impermanence. From what had been forgotten, a new form of memory grew, one not of rule but of understanding. In the towns that survived, life continued in smaller patterns. The people rebuilt houses from the stones of old monuments. They used the marble that once decorated palaces to make walls for gardens and wells. The empire's relics became part of ordinary living, their grandeur softened into usefulness. The past was not erased, but folded quietly into the present. Children played where emperors once walked, their laughter echoing through spaces once filled with ceremony. The contrast between what had been and what remained was vast, yet the world seemed balanced again. The silence of stone carried its own wisdom. It reminded those who listened that time was not an enemy, but a companion. The fall of empires was not destruction, but renewal, the necessary clearing that allowed new life to grow. Each ruin stood as a marker of both human ambition and human fragility. The stones that had once heard the cries of victory now heard only the wind, and in that wind there was peace. The earth, in its patience, did not mourn what was lost. It simply continued. As centuries turned, travelers and scholars returned to the ruins, drawn by curiosity and calm. They traced the lines of faded carvings, touched the rough edges of weathered pillars, and imagined the voices that had once filled those spaces. But what they found most striking was not what remained, but what had vanished. The absence itself became the source of meaning. In the stillness, they felt a connection to all who had come before the builders, the dreamers, the rulers, and the ordinary people who had walked the same paths. The silence united them across time, a bridge made not of sound, but of understanding. The ruins changed with the light. In morning they glowed pale and cool. At midday they burned bright beneath the sun. At dusk they turned gold, and shadows stretched long between the columns. When night came, the stars shone above them, bright and unbothered by what had passed below. In that starlight, the stones seemed almost alive, their edges softened, their surfaces breathing faint warmth from the day. The world felt balanced again, neither empty nor full, neither mourning nor rejoicing, only resting. The story of the fall of empires is the story of return. Everything built must one day yield to the flow of time. Every monument that rises must one day stand quiet beneath moss and dust. Yet this return is not defeat. It is the natural rhythm of existence. What falls becomes part of the soil. What is forgotten becomes part of memory. The silence that follows power is not absence but transformation, the world remembering itself beyond human design. As evening settles over the ancient ruins, the last light fades from the sky. The wind moves softly through the broken corridors. A single leaf drifts across the stone floor, carried by a current too light to hear. The air grows cool, the sounds of day fade into stillness. The stones remain unmoving, their weight eternal yet gentle. They no longer bear the burden of empire, they simply exist, calm and unafraid. In the distance, a river flows, the same river that has always been there, passing beside the fallen walls. Its water reflects the first stars of night. The sound is steady and low, a voice older than any kingdom. The river does not know the names of rulers. It remembers only the shape of the land and the path it must follow. Its rhythm has never changed. It moves forward, endlessly patient, carrying with it the memory of all that has come and gone. And so the empire's rest, their power dissolved into the still air, their legacy carried not in crowns or records, but in the quiet endurance of stone. The world turns, the sky remains, and the silence continues, deep, soft, eternal. The Forgotten Kingdoms of Sand and Wind. Beneath the endless sun, where the horizon ripples with heat and distance, lie the lands that once held kingdoms of sand. The wind moves quietly across the dunes, reshaping them with every hour. It leaves no mark, no trace of the cities that once stood here. Only fragments remain, half buried beneath the golden surface. The stones that once formed walls and towers now rest scattered, worn smooth by centuries of shifting air. The desert remembers everything, though it keeps its memories in silence. In these wide spaces, the days stretch long and slow. The light changes gently from pale gold in the morning to deep amber at dusk. The heat rises and fades like breath. The people who once lived here knew how to listen to the rhythm of the earth. They built their homes close to oases, where palms cast thin shadows over still water. Their walls were made of clay that cooled the air, their roofs open to the stars. They woke before the first light, when the sky was still grey, and the air held the scent of sand and dew. Life was measured by the movement of the sun and the return of the wind. The kingdoms of this region were quiet but enduring. They traded along long roads that crossed the desert like lines drawn by invisible hands. Caravans of camels moved in steady procession, carrying salt, spices, and stories. The travelers knew the stars as their map and the sound of their own breathing as their compass. When they reached a settlement, they rested in courtyards surrounded by carved pillars and soft lamps. Music drifted through the night as the people told stories of rivers that once flowed freely, of gardens that bloomed before the world grew dry. These were places of learning as well as of trade. In their shaded halls, scholars studied the movement of the heavens. They marked the paths of planets and the changing of seasons. They recorded their thoughts in flowing script upon parchment and stone. The hum of knowledge filled the air like the soft vibration of wind across the dunes. To them, understanding was a form of peace. To observe the world was to find harmony within it. Their wisdom was practical and patient, drawn from the same endurance that shaped the desert itself. The architecture of these kingdoms reflected the land around them. The buildings rose low and wide, their lines simple and measured. Arches framed the open sky, and courtyards gathered the wind into gentle motion. Water flowed in narrow channels through the gardens, bringing coolness to the air. The people valued shade more than height, silence more than grandeur. Their art was intricate yet calm, woven into fabrics and etched into stone. Patterns repeated like the waves of the dunes, a reflection of balance rather than ambition. Each mark was deliberate, every color chosen to rest easily upon the eye. As night fell, the desert transformed. The heat sank into the ground, and the stars emerged in perfect clarity. The sky above seemed endless, filled with slow rivers of light. The wind softened, carrying the faint scent of dust and myrrh. Around the fires, people sat in circles, wrapped in cloth against the cool air. They spoke quietly, their voices steady and measured. The stories they told were old and careful, passed through generations without haste. They spoke of creation and memory, of how the wind had once been a spirit of guidance and how the sand carried messages from the past. The desert was their teacher and silence their companion. In the morning, the sun returned, and the work began again. The rhythm of the day was never rushed. The people knew that in the desert, haste was a kind of blindness. To survive, one must move slowly, with respect for time and distance. The caravan leaders walked at the pace of the camels, steady and unbroken. Each step carried them forward, each pause gave them strength. When storms came, they waited, listening to the sound of the sand striking the fabric of their tents. The storm would pass. It always did. The desert taught patience better than any master. As centuries passed, these kingdoms grew and declined like the tides of a hidden sea. Some were lost to drought, others to trade that shifted toward the coast. The winds covered the ruins with layers of sand, hiding them from sight. Yet beneath the surface the stones remained. The carvings of their walls still hold the shapes of letters, the traces of poems and prayers. The desert preserves what the world forgets. It erases and remembers at once. Travelers who pass through these lands today find fragments of pottery gleaming in the light. They find the edges of walls, the faint outlines of roads that lead nowhere. When they walk upon these remnants, they hear the whisper of history carried by the wind. It is not a voice of sorrow, it is the calm rhythm of endurance. The desert is neither cruel nor kind. It is vast, and within that vastness all things become equal. Kingdom and traveler, stone and sand, day and night all move within the same circle. In one forgotten city, the remains of towers still rise from the dunes. Their tops are gone, but their bases hold firm. The walls are warm under the sun and cool at night. Inside, small birds nest in the crevices, their songs filling the air, where once the sound of bells echoed. The light moves gently across the stone, tracing patterns that change with the hour. At sunset, the ruins glow with soft color, and the desert seems to breathe. The air becomes still, as if listening. The silence that follows is complete, yet not empty. It carries a sense of peace that cannot be found in places still full of life. The people of later ages sometimes spoke of these vanished realms with wonder. They imagined them as golden cities, full of wealth and beauty beyond compare. But the truth was quieter. The kingdoms of sand were not built for display. They were built for survival, for harmony with a world that asked for humility. Their greatness lay not in size but in balance, not in conquest but in continuity. Even in their fall, they left no ruin of chaos, only the steady return of nature to its own form. At night, when the moon hangs low and the desert glows with silver light, the wind moves through the dunes, like breath through sleeping lungs. It carries the scent of distant water and the faint sound of shifting grains. Sometimes travelers believe they hear the echo of a drum, the rhythm of a caravan long gone. It is only the sound of the earth remembering itself. The desert holds these memories lightly, never clinging, never releasing fully. Each gust of wind reshapes the surface, yet beneath, the past remains unchanged. Time flows differently here. A century can pass like an afternoon. The sand moves, covers, uncovers, and moves again. The sun burns the same path each day, and the stars follow the same slow arcs across the sky. To live here is to understand the weight of stillness, the depth of silence, and the truth that all things are temporary, yet eternal in form. The forgotten kingdoms of sand are not lost. They are merely resting beneath the world's surface, dreaming in the heat, waiting in the wind. When dawn returns, the light touches the dunes with soft gold. The wind has already changed their shapes, smoothing one hill, building another. The desert never stays the same, yet it is always itself. It does not mourn what it has covered. It holds everything with equal grace. The old kingdoms are there still, their memory blended with the sand, their stories whispered through the moving air. And so the world continues. The travelers still cross the open plain, guided by the stars as their ancestors were. The sand shifts, the wind moves, the sun rises and falls. Nothing is lost, only transformed. The silence of the desert is deep, but within it lives a rhythm, the quiet pulse of existence that has no beginning and no end. The kingdoms are forgotten by name, but not by essence. They remain part of the great balance, as constant as the wind that erases them and the sand that keeps their memory hidden. As night comes again, the dunes cool beneath the moon. The wind softens until it becomes almost still. The stars shine above, bright and endless. The desert sleeps, the ruins sleep, the world sleeps, and in the vast silence between the grains of sand, the story of the forgotten kingdoms continues, unspoken, eternal, carried softly by the breath of time. The age of discovery and the endless horizon. The ocean stretched in every direction, endless and calm beneath the pale sky. Its surface shimmered with light, moving gently in long waves that seemed to breathe. For centuries, people had stood upon the shores of their lands and looked outward, wondering what lay beyond the line where water met air. The horizon was both invitation and boundary, quiet yet filled with possibility. The world was vast, and the people were ready to move across it. In the beginning, the ships were small. Their sails were woven by hand, their hulls built from wood, cut in forests near the coast. The sailors who stepped aboard carried little more than food, rope, and faith in their craft. They read the sea not with instruments but with their senses. They watched the color of the water, the flight of birds, the movement of clouds. At night, they followed the stars, those same lights that had guided the first wanderers across deserts and plains. The ocean became their road, and the wind their companion. Each voyage began in silence. The morning air smelled of salt and pine tar. The sailors moved with slow precision, preparing the ship for its long journey. When the tide rose, they pushed away from the shore. The sound of the waves against the wood became the rhythm of their days. Behind them, the land grew small. Before them, the open sea waited, endless and calm. The world that had once seemed complete now unfolded into something greater. For many of these travelers, discovery was not conquest but curiosity. They sought new lands, new currents, new ways of understanding the shape of the earth. They carried maps drawn from memory, filled with blank spaces waiting to be named. Each new coastline revealed was a small victory of knowledge, a quiet acknowledgement of the world's vastness. When storms came, the sailors did not curse the sea. They lowered the sails, tied the ropes, and waited. They knew that patience was stronger than force. The ocean respected calm more than courage. Weeks and months passed at sea. The days blurred into one another, marked only by the rising and setting of the sun. The sound of wind in the rigging, the creak of the boards, and the slow wash of water against the hull became the music of the journey. The sailors spoke little. Their thoughts moved with the rhythm of the waves. They learned to live by the smallest signs, a change in the scent of the air, the pattern of foam, the sudden appearance of birds far from land. Each detail was a message from the sea, quiet but clear. When land appeared at last, it did so without announcement. A line of green on the horizon, a faint shadow beneath the sky. The men stood in silence, watching as it grew nearer. The smell of earth reached them first, mixed with the sweetness of unknown flowers. They felt no triumph, only relief, as if the sea itself had allowed them to arrive. The shore was new, but the feeling was ancient, the sense of stepping into another part of the same world. They did not know what waited beyond the trees, only that they had reached the edge of the known and stepped beyond it. The new lands were vast and varied. Some were covered in forests that whispered beneath the wind. Some stretched into plains where rivers moved slowly through the grass. Others were islands surrounded by coral and light. The explorers walked carefully, listening to the sound of insects, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of birds. They wrote what they saw, drew what they could, and left markers to remember their passage. They were not conquerors then, but witnesses. The world revealed itself to them one quiet moment at a time. Back in their homelands, the maps began to change. Lines extended outward from familiar coasts, curving into unknown waters. Small drawings marked new continents and islands. The world grew larger on paper, even as it became smaller in reach. Knowledge spread like the slow turning of a tide, touching one shore after another. Cities that had once looked inward now opened their gates to the sea. Ships came and went like messengers, carrying goods, letters, and news of distant places. The ocean connected what had once been separate, and through that connection, the shape of humanity began to shift. The life of a sailor remained simple. Each morning began with the cleaning of decks and the setting of sails. Meals were shared in silence, the sound of the wind filling the spaces between words. The ocean demanded discipline and respect. A mistake could mean loss, yet fear had no place aboard a ship. The men worked as one, their movements practiced, their understanding unspoken. When storms rose, they moved together, guided by instinct and memory. When calm returned, they rested beneath the sun, watching the horizon with quiet eyes. The discoveries brought new trade, new knowledge, and new connections. Spices, fabrics, and ideas crossed the oceans as easily as ships did. Artists painted new worlds, writers described the lands beyond the horizon with care and wonder. Scholars studied the stars again, tracing the routes that linked one continent to another. The age of discovery was not only about distance, it was also about understanding. The people of the world began to see that the earth was one continuous circle, that every land touched the same sky, that the same wind moved through every shore. Yet even as the world grew more connected, it did not lose its mystery. The ocean remained vast, the deserts endless, the mountains unreachable. The explorers returned with stories of storms that rose without warning, of lights that danced upon the waves, of islands that appeared and vanished in mist. These tales were not born from fear, but from awe. The sea was not something to be conquered. It was a living force, patient and boundless, always reminding those who crossed it of their smallness. In time, the great voyages became routine. The maps filled with names the unknown turned familiar. But the feeling of wonder did not vanish. It lingered in the sound of sails catching wind, in the sight of dawn rising over the water, in the quiet understanding that the earth, though explored, could never be exhausted. Each journey carried the same peace, the knowledge that to move through the world was to move through time itself. In the harbors of the growing cities, ships stood side by side, their masts like forests of wood and rope. The air smelled of salt and spice, of smoke and tar. Sailors walked the docks with measured steps, their faces weathered by years of travel. They spoke in many languages, their gestures familiar even when their words were not. Trade had made the world one, but the sea had made it humble. The ocean gave and took in equal measure, and all who crossed it understood that balance. As centuries passed, new kinds of ships appeared. They were larger, faster, and built for greater distance. Yet the rhythm of the sea remained unchanged. The same wind filled their sails, the same stars guided their way, the same silence waited at the edges of the world. The explorers of later ages still stood upon the decks at night, watching the moon reflect upon the water, feeling the pull of the horizon that never ended. The ocean reminded them, as it had reminded those before, that discovery was not a moment but a state of being, an openness to the vastness of life. When evening fell upon the sea, the sky turned from blue to deep gold, and then to silver. The surface of the water mirrored the light until sky and ocean became one. The sailors lay upon the deck, listening to the gentle sound of waves against wood. The ship drifted softly, carried by currents that had moved since before memory began. The world was still, yet alive with motion too subtle to see. In that stillness, they found peace. The age of discovery never truly ended. The maps may be filled, the continents named, the routes known, but the horizon remains. It is always there, waiting at the edge of sight, silent and infinite. Every traveler who looks toward it feels the same quiet pull that once guided the first explorers into the unknown. The sea still moves with its slow breath, and the stars still shine with their ancient light. The world continues to reveal itself to those who look with patience. As night deepens, the waves grow darker and the line of the horizon disappears. The ship becomes a small shadow upon the vastness of the sea. Above, the constellations shimmer. Below, the water reflects their glow like liquid glass. The sailors close their eyes. The ocean rocks them gently, steady and timeless. The world sleeps around them. The wind whispers through the sails. The sea continues its endless song, calm, eternal, and unbroken. The age of machines and the dimming light. The dawn of the new age arrived without thunder or fire. It came in the steady rhythm of metal against metal, in the hum of wheels turning, in the faint hiss of steam escaping into the air. Cities began to stir with a new kind of energy, one that did not depend on the rise and fall of the sun. Smoke drifted upward from tall chimneys, spreading through the morning light like thin clouds. The world began to move faster, yet beneath the motion there remained the same quiet pulse of time that had always guided it. The people of this age built machines that changed everything. They filled the valleys with tracks of iron, and along those tracks moved engines that breathed like living creatures. The trains crossed mountains and rivers, carrying people and goods farther than any ship or caravan before. The sound of their wheels became the new rhythm of the earth, a continuous whisper of progress. Villages that had once stood alone became connected by rails and smoke. The world grew smaller, and life moved within it, like a current finding new paths. In the great cities, factories rose beside the rivers. Their walls were tall and their windows narrow. Inside, the air was warm with the smell of oil and fire. Machines turned day and night, their movements precise and unending. The workers who tended them learned the same patience once found in sailors and farmers. They stood beside the rhythm of invention, their bodies moving in time with the pulse of metal. The work was demanding, but it carried a strange calm, each sound, each motion repeated with such constancy that it became a kind of song. Outside, the streets filled with movement. Horses pulled carriages between markets and homes. The gas lamps burned through the fog, their light reflected in puddles on the cobblestones. Children ran beside the carts, their laughter mixing with the clang of distant bells. The cities were alive with motion and noise, yet within that noise there was order. Every sound had a place, every moment its purpose. People spoke of progress as if it were the wind itself, invisible yet unstoppable. As the years passed, the machines became more refined. The engines grew smaller and stronger. The trains moved faster. Ships powered by steam replaced sails on the oceans. The steady beat of oars and the creak of wood gave way to the deep vibration of engines beneath iron hulls. The sea, once ruled by wind and patience, now carried the constant murmur of industry. The horizon remained, but the way to reach it had changed. The journey no longer depended on the whims of nature, but on the certainty of invention. With every discovery, the boundaries of the world shifted again. Light no longer belonged to the sun alone. Lamps filled with new energy illuminated the nights. Cities that had once slept under darkness began to glow. Windows shone through the mist, bridges gleamed above the rivers, and the quiet rhythm of the night changed into a continuous hum. The darkness that had once guided rest became softer, touched by the flicker of artificial stars. The people stayed awake longer, their work and their dreams extended by the power of the new light. The sound of machines became the heartbeat of this age. In fields, great iron plows replaced the slow strength of animals. In workshops, tools shaped steel and glass with precision unknown before. The people marveled at what their hands could create. They built towers that reached toward the sky, bridges that spanned impossible distances, and ships that carried thousands across the sea. The world seemed limitless again, though this time it was not the horizon that drew them forward, but the promise of progress. The ancient rhythm of nature still surrounded them, yet its quiet song was often drowned beneath the sound of their own invention. In the evenings, when the factories closed and the streets grew still, the new silence carried a different tone. The air smelled faintly of smoke and iron. The rivers that once ran clear now carried traces of dust and oil. The stars above the cities were harder to see, their light dimmed by the haze that lingered in the air. Yet there was beauty even in this change. The glow of lamps along the streets reflected softly on the water. The hum of distant engines faded into the night like a slow, steady breath. The people who walked home from their work carried the warmth of fire and movement within them. The city, alive with its own rhythm, seemed to dream. Art changed with the times. Painters no longer looked only to the fields and mountains, but to the geometry of iron and glass. Writers described the new landscapes of machines and motion, finding poetry in the sound of engines and the sight of light through smoke. Musicians listened to the rhythm of factories and trains, turning their steady beat into melody. Beauty was not lost. It had only transformed. The harmony that once came from nature now came from the pulse of human creation. It was a different kind of stillness, born not of silence, but of repetition. The world began to spin faster, yet time itself remained unchanged. Days still rose and fell with the sun, seasons still moved across the land. The people had altered their surroundings, but not the rhythm of existence. Beneath the smoke and the light, the rivers still flowed, the trees still grew, and the sky still carried the same calm presence it had since the beginning. The balance had shifted, but the pattern endured. The machines had joined the cycle rather than replaced it. In the quieter towns far from the cities, the changes arrived more slowly. The fields still shimmered under the same sun, though the sound of distant engines sometimes reached their borders. Farmers began to use new tools that made their labor easier. The markets filled with goods from distant places. Letters traveled faster, news arrived sooner. The world felt closer, though the old pace of life lingered in the air. Even with all the new inventions, the evening still brought silence. The lamps burned softly, the wind moved through the grass, and the stars returned above the horizon. As generations passed, the machine became not just a tool, but a presence. It was part of daily life, as common as rain or fire. The people no longer noticed its sound. It became part of the background, like the hum of the earth itself. Children grew up knowing nothing else, their games shaped by the rhythm of the modern age. They looked at the lights of the city and saw comfort, not intrusion. They listened to the noise of industry and heard progress, not disturbance. The new world had settled into its own kind of peace. But beneath the light and movement, a subtle change had begun. The pace of life, once guided by the slow rhythm of nature, now followed the quick pulse of the machine. Time felt shorter, though it had not changed. People measured their days by schedules rather than seasons. The fields of rest grew smaller, replaced by fields of production. The stillness that once filled the night grew thin. The light that had banished darkness now shone without pause. The world was brighter, yet the brightness carried a quiet weight, like a flame that burned too long. Still, there was beauty in this new order. The sight of trains crossing valleys at dusk, their windows glowing softly in the fading light. The sound of ships' horns drifting across the water, echoing through the fog. The reflection of city lights upon rivers, shimmering like broken stars. The people of this age had created a landscape of light and sound that mirrored their own energy. It was not the peace of stillness, but the peace of motion that never ceased. As the century turned and the machines grew more complex, the first signs of wear appeared. The cities expanded, the air thickened, and the quiet places became fewer. Yet even as the world grew louder, moments of silence remained. Early in the morning, before the factories began their work, the streets were empty and the air cool. The first light touched the rooftops, and for a brief time, the city seemed to rest. The wind carried away the smoke and the horizon glowed pale and clean. In those moments, one could still hear the echo of the old world beneath the hum of the new. Night falls again upon the cities of the machine age. The lamps flicker softly, the streets empty, and the hum of engines fades into distance. High above, the clouds glow faintly from the light below. The stars are few, but they are still there, shining through the veil of progress. The machines rest, the people sleep, and the world breathes in rhythm with the quiet turning of its own creation. The age of machines continues, not with noise, but with the steady murmur of existence, a reminder that even in motion, there is peace. The digital dawn and the last light. The world entered another kind of dawn. It was not born from the rising of the sun, but from the quiet glow of screens in the dark. The hum of machines became softer, replaced by the invisible rhythm of data moving through wires and waves. The air carried signals that no ear could hear, connecting people across oceans and mountains with the speed of thought. The cities no longer needed smoke or steam to pulse with life. They breathed in silence, lit by countless points of artificial light that shimmered like stars brought down to earth. In this new age, time moved differently. The day no longer began with morning, but with connection. The first sound was the soft chime of a message, the flicker of a screen awakening. The people of this era no longer traveled by sea or road to reach one another. Their journeys happened through invisible paths of information. Words, images, and voices moved faster than wind, carried through a network that stretched across the entire planet. The distance between hearts grew smaller, yet the silence between thoughts seemed greater. The machines of this world were small and weightless. They fit into hands and pockets, glowing with quiet light. Within them lived memories, knowledge, and dreams. The people built a new kind of space, one without walls or borders. In this space, everything could exist at once. It was a world of reflection, where the past and the present stood side by side and where the future seemed always within reach. The old maps had ended, but a new kind had begun. One drawn in light instead of ink. One that expanded endlessly without edge. As the years passed, the digital dawn brightened, information became the new ocean, and humanity sailed across it without sails or ships. Every thought left a trace, every movement a mark. The world learned to speak in signals and code. The hum of servers replaced the sound of waves. The horizon was no longer made of water or land, but of data that never stopped flowing. The people became travelers again, though their journeys now took place within themselves through words, memories, and the invisible threads that linked them together. The rhythm of life changed once more. Work, art, and conversation moved into the quiet glow of the network. The sound of the world grew softer, almost still, yet beneath that stillness there was constant motion. The new world never slept. It shimmered in every direction at once, its light reflected in the eyes of those who gazed into it. The night lost its darkness. The stars, once far above, now had mirrors below. The digital sky spread across every surface, and the people lived within its glow. Amid this brightness, a new silence appeared, not the silence of nature, but the silence of too much sound. The air was full of voices that spoke all at once. The people listened, but it was harder to hear. The calm that once lived in the rhythm of waves or wind became something rare. The hum of the digital world was constant, endless, and invisible. Yet even here, within this quiet noise, moments of peace could still be found. A single image, a message sent in kindness, a pause before the next thought. These small things became the echoes of stillness in a world that no longer stopped moving. The earth itself watched quietly as the humans filled it with light. The oceans continued their slow tides. The forests breathed. The mountains stood. Nature did not vanish. It waited. Beneath the noise of data and power, the same rhythms of wind and water remained. When the people lifted their eyes from their screens and looked outward, they still saw the sky. The stars were still there, though fewer were noticed. The sun still rose, warming the same rivers, shining on the same stones. The old world and the new one coexisted, layered upon one another like reflections on a calm surface. As the digital age matured, the world became more connected than ever, yet also more fragile. The networks that carried voices could also carry silence. The systems that spread light could also dim. The people learned to balance between presence and pause, between movement and rest. The machines had given them speed, but they began to seek stillness again. In gardens and along rivers, they rediscovered the quiet language of the natural world. They listened to the rustle of leaves, the song of birds, the steady breath of the sea. In those moments, the noise of the digital world softened, and the older rhythm returned. The generations that grew up in this time carried both worlds within them. They understood the pulse of technology and the calm of the earth. They spoke to one another through invisible lines, but still found comfort in the touch of another hand, in the warmth of shared silence. The screens around them became windows, not prisons. They learned to turn them off, to step into the air, to feel the wind move through the trees. The world, though changed, had not lost its beauty. It had only hidden it behind the light. In the end, the story of humanity had come full circle. From stone to empire, from sea to sky, from machine to signal, every age had reached outward and then returned inward. The same pattern repeated: discovery, creation, transformation, and rest. The people had crossed oceans and deserts, built towers and cities, woven wires across the planet, and filled the air with messages. Yet the quiet truth remained unchanged. The earth continued its slow turning beneath their feet, and the stars continued their silent dance above. As the centuries passed into memory, the boundaries between the physical and the digital blurred. The world became a mirror of thought, an ocean of connection that held both presence and absence. The people no longer sought to master it. They learned instead to live within it, gently. The light of their screens reflected softly on their faces as they watched the horizon glow with real dawn. The sun rose as it always had, touching the sea, the fields, the mountains, and the towers. The light of the machines dimmed, but the light of the world remained. Even in the most advanced cities where technology shaped every breath, silence could still be found. It lived in the early hours before the world awakened, in the moments when the streets were empty and the sky turned pale. The hum of the network faded to a whisper, and in that whisper, the same peace that once filled the deserts, the seas, and the ruins returned. The story of progress had never been a story of noise. It was always a story of rhythm, the slow balance between creation and calm, movement and stillness. The people began to understand that their greatest invention was not the machine or the network, but awareness itself. To see the world as whole, to listen, to breathe, to exist without haste, these became the new discoveries. The age of light, both natural and artificial, ended not in brightness but in serenity. The cities glowed softly beneath the night sky. The oceans reflected the stars as they always had. The wind carried the same sound it had carried through every age, a low and steady murmur, endless and kind. And when night fully came, the lights dimmed across the world. Screens went dark, one by one. The machines rested, the cities slept. Above them, the sky returned to its ancient clarity. The stars shone freely again, each one a memory of what had been and what would always remain. The earth turned slowly beneath their light, carrying the stories of all who had lived upon it, from the empires of stone to the silent glow of the digital dawn. The horizon no longer divided the known from the unknown. It had become a circle, complete and calm. The story had reached its quiet end, not with an ending at all, but with a breath, a soft exhale of time. The light of the world continued, steady and eternal, guiding everything back into silence.